There was a lot to take away from the draft last night for the Chicago Bulls, which I know sounds odd because the Bulls made their pick at 18 and that was really it. No trades, whether up or down in the draft. No movement of players, even after all the trade rumors leading up to the draft about the Bulls shopping Kobe White and the 18th pick. Maybe even packaging the first round pick from Portland as well, which is now looking more likely to convey after they acquired Jeremy Grant. I know some thought would be that the Bulls, you would be hearing some big news in a potential trade of landing Rudy Gobert. That some, meaning myself, who thought that. I'm sure others did as well, but that's what I was expecting. And then, of course, Bulls Twitter went crazy when it was announced that Kyrie Irving is likely going to be on the move from the Brooklyn Nets, which then put into question Kevin Durant's future in remaining with the team if Kyrie leaves. So naturally, Bulls fans went crazy saying we should go after Kevin Durant. There was just so much hype and discussion leading up to the draft last night that really just ended in the Bulls, again, drafting Dalen Terry, which doesn't mean that the front office is done. Obviously, moves can be made in the coming days, and then, of course, free agency commences next week. But aside from the Bulls making their selection and that really being their only move, there was still a lot to unpack because we got to hear from the Bulls GM, Marc Eversley, after the pick was made, which was the first time that we had heard from any executive from the Bulls front office since back at the season-ending exit interview from Arturas Karnisovas. So in today's video, we're going to be discussing in a little more detail the Bulls draft pick and key takeaways from Eversley's press conference. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, real quick, if you're new to the channel and you enjoy the content, be sure to subscribe, especially if you're a Bulls fan. I do appreciate all of the support on the channel recently, and I'll be sure to keep the content going throughout the offseason and going into next season. But anyway, so last night, the Bulls drafted Dalen Terry out of Arizona, which I said in my initial reaction video from last night that I was pretty surprised by. Like, of all of the mock draft projections for who the Bulls could be selecting at 18, Dalen Terry was not on my radar at all. I said in a prior video that I actually wanted the Bulls to take EJ Liddell, and I really thought he was going to be the pick when the Bulls were on the clock and he was still available. And somehow he slid all the way to 41. I mean, I guess there was something the fans and the media didn't see about this kid that caused him to slip that far in the draft. But in a way, you kind of have to be a little surprised that the Bulls didn't look to move down in the draft by acquiring other assets to also still get EJ Liddell later on. Or how about Walker Kessler, the big man out of Auburn, was one of the best shot blockers in the country last season. He ended up going number 22 overall. But for a team that has emphasized so much the need for more size and rim protection, a guy like Kessler would have been a great option coming off the bench behind Vucevic. Now, this isn't to say I think the front office made a mistake in selecting Terry, because they obviously know the game of basketball way better than I ever will, and it's why they're in the role that they have and why I'm just some random dude on YouTube. And Arturas had emphasized in the past that drafting at 18, it's more about drafting the best player available more so than fit, which that I totally get. You draft the best player available and figure it out later. I was just surprised that they saw Dalen Terry as the best player available at 18. But if there is one thing we know about Arturas, both in his time in Denver and now with the Bulls, he has a knack for drafting overlooked players that possess high upside potential. And for Dalen Terry, there is a lot to like about this kid. And I talked about this a bit in my last video, but most importantly is his determination and desire to get to work and provide an impact to this team immediately. I've talked about this in the past. There is something to be said about players who have the right mindset going into the NBA, come in wanting to be a sponge, learn from the veterans, soak up all their knowledge and experience, and always be striving to get better, and proving any doubters wrong. We saw that last season with Dosunmu. I was always asking questions of the players, always looking for advice and feedback on his play from guys like DeMar, Zach, and Vucevic, another player that was overlooked and went into the second round. He kept working, kept grinding, soaked up as much as he could, and proved to be an impactful player for the Bulls roster last year, especially with Lonzo Ball being out and also getting selected all-rookie second team as a result. Dalen Terry, another guy who said both at the draft combine as well as last night in his media availability after being selected, he remembers the names of all the players selected ahead of him. At the combine, he said 10 years from now, they'll do a redraft and he'll be at the top of the leaderboard. This was when he was asked about being a projected late first rounder. So, you know, Terry is another guy who has a chip on his shoulder, has a ton of confidence, but also knows he has a lot to learn in areas of his game that he still needs to work on. If you didn't catch his media availability via Zoom last night, the excitement and energy that he displayed in wanting to be drafted by the Bulls, the fact that he told Marc Eversley, I'll run to where you guys are right now and get started. He's ready to start grinding. He wants to be an immediate impact to this team and not just a project player that doesn't doesn't see a ton of playing time in his first few seasons. Now, aside from his determination, his desire and work ethic that he exudes, and the energy that he brings, that dog-like mentality the Bulls could really use on their roster, there are a lot of things to like about Dalen Terry, even just aside from that. He's a versatile wing who can guard multiple positions. He's a scrappy defender with his wingspan, very athletic, good court vision, and high IQ. He also is an okay shooter, a decent shooter from deep. A lot of people were talking about how he is the definition of a 3-and-D type of player, something the Bulls could really use, as we were really deficient on the wing this past season. And with Derrick Jones Jr. and Troy Brown Jr. likely not returning to the roster, you're going to need more wing depth and someone who can come off the bench behind DeMar or Zach. My biggest hesitations around Terry is how much his game will actually translate to the NBA, especially as it relates to guarding bigger wings and power forwards that obviously you're not going to see at the NCAA level. He's pretty slender, 6'7", 195 pounds. If he can put on a little more weight to be able to be a force on the defensive end, that would be huge for the Bulls, as again, the Bulls really don't have that right now. The other thing that had me a little confused about the pick and why it makes me a little hesitant is that he seems to be a little more raw, more of a project that could develop into a nice player down the line, but doesn't really fit a team that is, for all intents and purposes, looking to win now. That was the other thing. I mean, even though the Bulls were looking for the best player available, I would have also thought they would look for that player who can kind of straddle the lines between future upside potential, but a guy who can also contribute right away, given the timeline of the Bulls. But maybe Terry is that guy, and that's what they see in him. What I will say is I do like the long-term upside potential of Dalen Terry. Like, he's going to fit the long-term timeline of Patrick Williams and Dosunmu. I think he could be a very impactful role player a few years from now. I don't see future all-star potential in him, but a role player that is critical to a team's success, like a Tony Kukoc. Not comparing their games directly because they're not at all the same, just more so the type of impact Kukoc brought to the Bulls back in the 90s. I kind of see a ceiling of something like that for Dalen Terry. Now, I did want to highlight some of the key takeaways from Marc Eversley's press conference when asked questions outside of their draft selection. Marc was asked about Zach Lavine's free agency, of course, mandatory question, and Marc was pretty emphatic, saying, quote, "We're prepared to do what it will take to bring Zach back into the fold," which really doesn't come as a surprise. There were reports that came out recently citing that interested teams are now being informed that Zach is planning on re-signing for the Bulls for the max. Really, it's becoming more and more certain that Zach will be back with the Bulls, despite there being some initial concern that he might be going elsewhere because of the comments he made in his exit interview. But I think at the end of the day, we all knew that Zach Lavine was going to be staying with the Bulls with the amount of money they could offer him over any other team in the league. The other thing that was discussed was Lonzo's rehab on his knee, and if there was any progress that has been made since we had last heard from them at the end of the season, even from Lonzo himself, was that his rehab was at a bit of a standstill. Marc did say that Lonzo continues working with the performance staff and that by all indicators things are going well and progressing. However, he did not commit to Lonzo being ready to go by the start of training camp in September. When asked about it, all that he said was, "I certainly hope so," meaning that he'll be ready by training camp. I don't know if you can call that positive news per se. I mean, it's great that Lonzo is making progress, but this was a surgery that happened in January that had an estimated timeline of return of 6 to 8 weeks, and he still hasn't fully recovered 6 months after the fact. And even still, there is, even minor, a bit of uncertainty as to whether he'll be ready to go by training camp. I don't know. I mean, you guys know, I've said this before, it's the same knee he already had surgery on after his rookie season for the same procedure. That is concerning if you're the Bulls for his general long-term health when he's only 24 years old. But at the same time, I'm sure Eversley can't just say, "Oh, well, he'll be back by training camp," no question, when that's so far away. Even if by all indicators is that he'll be fine and back to normal by training camp, that might not be something that he would be able to comfortably share given the medical staff's recommendation. So I understand the vague response that an executive would have to give to the media, but it's still a little unsettling if you're a Bulls fan. The other tidbit that I thought was interesting, and this was actually related to the Bulls picking Dalen Terry, not specifically to Terry, but when asked about what are the Bulls' other plans to round out the roster based on the draft pick that was made last night. He touched on the need for rim protection alongside Vooch, which the only reason that I found that interesting, because needing rim protection is nothing new. We all know the Bulls need size and rim protection, but it was the fact that he emphasized around Nikola Vucevic, because there has been so much trade talk centered around Rudy Gobert, which Vucevic would have to be included in a trade for Gobert. So much speculation to the point where you had some outlets saying the Bulls are the most likely destination to land Gobert, and that a trade seem inevitable at this point. So for all of those hoping there is going to be this blockbuster trade that is sending Rudy Gobert to the Bulls, might want to pump the brakes on that, because I don't think Eversley would have emphasized the need to build rim protectors around Vucevic if there was a trade for Gobert in the works. And it kind of holds true to the front office's word around continuity and keeping this core together, which would involve keeping Vucevic. Vooch is also up for an extension, and there were a few reports that came out saying that Vooch is wanting to sign an extension with the Bulls, but nothing has come to fruition surrounding that yet. But either way, based on those comments, it doesn't look like the front office is looking to make a big shakeup of moving on from Vucevic. It seems like they're looking to bring in cheaper, more cost-effective options that fit their cap space, that can provide the requisite defense in the paint that the Bulls need. Anyway, those were really the three biggest takeaways from the press conference with Marc Eversley last night, as well as more info on Dalen Terry. Let me know what you guys thought of the draft pick, as well as any insights I might have missed from the Bulls GM. Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.